Azu, welcome to Gazelli Art House. I'm going to clap for that. First, I just really want to thank Mila Askarova, the owner of the gallery, and everything she's done to support this show. It's been an amazing experience for me already, and having you guys here in a way that I can actually feel, which didn't happen at the opening, is pretty deep and soulful, and I really appreciate you all coming. I said to myself, don't get dramatic and cry. I really didn't think it would happen before Azu's even said one word, so I'll just pass it straight over to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you all for coming. First of all, I'd like to thank Mila, of course, and Fernanda and the entire team at Gazelli for hosting this exhibition and having me over. I think Gazelli is one of the few art galleries left that actually support artists in a proper way, like, from start conception to realization. So it's really important, the business of the art world, to think about the ecosystem beyond just the sale. So lots of thanks to Gazelli Art House for doing this. I think the work that James has done for this show, it's really incredible. And the thing that interests curators and people like myself is really the processes in making work, not just the product itself, the finished product. So hopefully we can have an interesting discussion about how we got here and why we got here.
Well, I guess that could start by Azu coming up to me at Art 15, the art fair in London, as chic as he's dressed now, but with sunglasses on indoors, which not everyone can pull off, with a beautiful smile, just going, I love what you do, I want to take it to Lagos. And my response to that was that, I suddenly realized an ambition I actually never knew I had. And then he followed that by saying, and now I would love you to come to Lagos as well with the work. And my immediate response to that was like, I don't think so, I'm scared, I don't want to go. And so I guess that's the starting point of, the backbone of this, the journey of this body of work was me in that moment having to, evaluate why was that my instantaneous reaction to being invited to sub-Saharan Africa, and actually, having traveled large amounts of the world myself in various forms of work or just, pleasure, why I'd avoided Africa. And that was really basically undermined by a fear, actually, and I suppose the overall branding of Africa. So, from like, my echo chamber of how I experienced the presentation of Africa, whether that was in the 80s through, Bob Geldof and all that with Ethiopia, or, general warmongering films or ludicrousness. And so I sort of passed back to you, Azu, about, why is Africa, for people like ignorant people like me, or people who haven't been blessed to go there, or in whatever my micro bubble is, why is there that sort of presentation of Africa so dominant?
Well, that's a huge question.
Well, the whole talk could be on that. I don't mind.
I think it comes back to what we're doing here, which is and what the intention of Lagos Photo Festival, which hosted your exhibition and hosted a whole bunch of international and local artists, which is sort of hosting and presenting and engaging. And it's, if you think about all of the important art events or cultural events globally, very few actually happen on the continent in Africa. So that sort of engagement is, to my mind, the most honest space to begin to have a cultural dialogue. And if Africa has been denied this opportunity of hosting, then these sort of, the kind of exchange that we had in Lagos, where you met a whole bunch of interesting artists, diverse artists working all over the world, would have never happened. So I think one of the problems is there's a the dominant or the predominant narrative around Africa is really mainstream media. Mainstream media is all about sensationalism, and it's not just Africa, it's Middle East, it's Asia. There's the cliches dominate, so but when you have the opportunity to really create a cultural dialogue, then we begin to break down these barriers.
So one thing, I phoned up, I sent Azu a text earlier and I said, what are we going to talk about? I'm a little bit nervous. He just wrote back, lol, it's going to be fine, it's you and me. So that's about as far as my notes have gone on this. And then I sort of had this idea that, historically, if I've ever been to something, I've had a question inside of me I was too stressed out to eventually ask, or there was always people who might arrive with a predetermined question they had in their mind that they were going to ask irrespective of what me and Azu said. So I just wondered if there was any one of those people here who was like, I'm going to fuck him up with this question. So why don't we just start with that? No pressure.
I wanted to ask what it was about James's work that you were interested in.
Oh yes, if I remember, I have a few people from Lagos here actually. At the time, the theme of the festival was designing futures, and so James's work has a very strong design aesthetic about it, and so at the work that we showed in Lagos, and a lot of the work that you see here as well, always engages a sort of critical design aesthetic where objects that are in the photograph are repurposed to create another layer of meaning. And at the time, it was the sugar sculptures.
What's
and
it all about?
What's it all about with the sugar sculpture that really had that sort of engagement where each individual would really engage with the work in a very personal but a very unique way, and it sort of fit in with the theme at the time. And of course, I didn't know James. I just sort of walked up to him, and he was sat at the booth, and we had a very quick conversation, and I walked up, and we just stayed in touch the whole time via email. And I believe you had an incident at the airport.
That's the thing. There's so many different things I want to talk about, and I'm so excited about Azu being here. It's like I really don't want to listen to the sound of my own voice either. So it's like I'm going to try and break it down in my mind what I feel like maybe we should discuss. Does everyone know the flip-flops came from Nigeria, collected off the beach, or is that a surprise to anyone? Hand up if you knew they were from Nigeria.
Oh, well, that's a knowledgeable
So we probably don't need to go there too much, other than the fact that, Azu kindly invited me to Lagos Photo Festival, like he mentioned, which he started, and supported by Mila. In fact, I think someone had incorrectly booked the flight because I flew actually business class to Lagos, which was mind-blowing. I've never done it since. But I had this sort of one-on-one interaction with the guy who was serving me lots of drinks that were water, and he was like, what hotel are you staying in? And I mentioned the name of the hotel. He's like, I don't know that hotel. You should come and stay at the one we all stay at, and we only roll with armed guards from the airport to the hotel. So as if I wasn't stressed enough already by having actually spoken to a number of different people about whether I should come to Lagos to be a part of Azu's festival, which thank God I did. And it ranged from a span of people, CEOs of companies, friends, family, a diverse enough selection of people that I feel like I can say I have a diverse enough selection of friends. In the end, it amounted to me asking the father of my godchildren. I was like, so, what do you think? He's a global security expert. He knew where bin Laden was 2 years before the Americans admit it. I think he knows what he's talking about. And he was like, yeah, fine, Lagos is cool. Just don't take a taxi from the airport. Fine. So I phoned them up. I was like, is there going to be someone to pick me up? They're like, yeah, Mohammed's going to pick you up. He's going to be there with your name on the sign. I get through the airport. My Mohammed wasn't there. I freaked out and ran back through the airport. Literally. And in the end, I actually probably spoke to Maria Pia over there, where I was like, unless I see a face that I saw in London, I'm on the next plane home. So that was the beginning of our professional relationship, basically. So Azu's been an incredibly sort of loving and caring person, and someone who, you know, actually actions what he says he's trying to do, which is to have a voice coming from within Africa going out, as well as, like, you know, Azu not having, and what I find particularly interesting about Azu, I'm talking about you as if you're not here, but I'm going to try and pass it over to him so he can actually say something without me neurotically, nervously, non-stop chatting. But I'm interested in your view on cultural appropriation, and also like non-African artists coming in to Africa and making art as if they should or could or are entitled to have a perspective about Africa. So sort of back to you on that one.
Oh, yeah. I feel like when people talk about cultural appropriation, it's often, the language is often tainted. It's never really cultural appropriation. It's people are speaking oftentimes about different situations. So no one owns culture, in my view. Culture is it's how we do things, how we create an ecosystem to sort of make progress in the world and to find our balance and find our own space in the world. So oftentimes when there's a problem, it's not really appropriation. It's just if someone is being rude or being disrespectful or being just not really. It's not really about cultural appropriation. Appropriation is almost a misnomer in my view, because all culture is really about appropriation. You know, you take what works here, and culture is reductionist. It's progressive. It's about just sort of making progress in the world. So it's very difficult to talk about it without specific, you know, incidents. And in terms of Western artists or Western journalists, which is, I don't even think that's appropriation. It's just either theft or misrepresentation or fake news. It's all of these things, but rarely is it ever cultural appropriation. The few incidents that people talk about cultural appropriation is often a good thing, and it's often a useful, progressive, positive thing.
One thing I said to myself in this friendship was I'm just going to ask Azu whatever I feel I can ask, knowing that he will say to me, why would you even ask me that? Or actually that's a form of privilege to even suggest that in such a ludicrous way. And so once you remove those parameters of concern within a dialogue that's respectful in terms of friendship and professionality, you can ask, and have conversations like we did in Lagos, where I'm like, so Azu, do you think the white male is the problem with the world? Which is a question for me that was exciting to be able to ask within the context and the narrative of, obviously where we are now within the context of Trump and what's going on with the film business, and and rightfully so, because you're looking at a power structure where white men are leading what I suppose in terms of the discussion of this show has been discussing the tribal elite. And yeah. I loved your answer. You said, well, there's a lot of African dictators who are black who really aren't that. So, and I was like, okay, well, that's the end of that one. I can move on from my fear-based Guardian reading kind of leftist paranoia and get into something else conversationally.
Yeah, it's so one of the legacies of colonialism, which is what really is the point of departure for that sort of question, was is what I term post-colonial cannibalism, where it's not really about race anymore. It's really about the power structures. So you replace one power structure with another, and it doesn't really matter who's there. It's just everyone wants to eat everyone up to sort of get to the top. So it's a legacy of interruption of economic, cultural, social, political, constantly interrupting itself, where people aren't thinking of making progress in a structured way, and it's all about the one person, the self, the ego, the individual, because if you think about the African dictators, all of them were propped up by Western institutions or Western banks or the colonial powers that sort of put them in place. So I do not sort of absolve the West or colonial legacy of its guilt or its responsibility, but I also feel like if sort of harping back to it is not the solution. It's sort of the solution is really bottom up rather than arching back to the power that sort of creates that hegemony.
So another question I thought about today, because I've spent quite a lot of time in Silicon Valley in the last 12, 13, 14 years actually. For example, not that I'm trying to give myself a credential, like some of my friends are in the first 25 users of Instagram. I had this amazing conversation with Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, before anyone was on it. And so I've sort of seen from beginning to where we are now as a passenger, really, of watching that. And then, when I've been thinking about the power within the context of the human race, and referring back to what I said about, this, by the way, all this stuff I'm talking about right now 5 years ago, I'd have been like, are you fucking joking? You're not qualified to even have this conversation. So if anyone's thinking that, I am too, while I'm saying this. But what my fear is that we're being deceived into thinking that the power shift is actually in some ways disseminating away from that, the white male through various forms of media, presenting it otherwise, quite wonderfully LGBT community are going more airwaves, people of colour are, so on. But from what I see, almost from the inside, is that actually the power shift is going to the white male that almost has like there is a strand of autism in it, because you couldn't be an incredible programmer without that in your mind. You just wouldn't be a great programmer. And those are the people who are actually defining how, as a species, the decisions of how we're going to evolve is through technology. And so my question to you, when I was thinking about this today, is, well, that's coming from my perspective being in Silicon Valley, but I also remember having lunch with you in an amazing hotel in Hyde Park Corner and meeting the guy who's launching African Netflix. So it's like, I have this idea that the power shift's going to the white male in San Fran, but what's your view?
I think it's really about engagement and agency. So literature, contemporary visual culture, music, all of these various art forms, I feel like if we have to have a wider engagement and ownership within these art forms to be able to tell our own stories. And in terms of the power structure, when you have the opportunity to use the same media that sort of creates the pejorative, predominant negative about the continent, or has told the story of the continent from using film, literature, music, performance, all of these art forms are really important, and the more we participate in these forms, the more we can take agency of them. Staying away from it or staying outside of it does not empower you at all. So it's really about engagement and being aware of all the pitfalls around it and trying to be part of the ownership structure. So which is why we started the festival, which is the reason I took the job in Cape Town, to be able to be part of the global player. You cannot sort of deny the system, it exists, and you just have to find a way to be part of it and to engage and to tell the stories that you think are important. And I think all voices are legitimate, so it's not about the white or the black, it's about multiplicity of stories, it's a multiplicity of voices, multiplicity of narratives. The plurality that we have from having more women, more men of color, as you say, or or a wider geographical spread within the cultural framework is really the only way to find truth in the world. I suppose other people might want to have...
Yeah, I'm hesitating because I was just blown away by that.
I'm really interested in
Wait for the mic,
Sorry. I'm really interested in your last show, which was Sweetie Project, and how that's changed and your filter from going to Africa and then you now making this work and how it's changed. It's a lot more grittier. It uses some of the same formulas, but it's changed and developed. And what was it? What made that happen?
What's the trigger?
Well, I mean, I guess that's a great question, thank you. For me, the reason I became an artist was really to absolve my internal conflict. And so, in the same way as, you might look at Tracy Emin's Bed as a reference to how she felt at that time, and it was a portrait of herself. Like, my early work, was much more confrontational in terms of my emotional experience with myself. And in fact, the film Through the Gap There, Snuffling for Love Truffles, I made that in 2015. So, that was a self-portrait. It started off as a self-portrait. It's taken me 3 years to show it and feel comfortable doing so within the context of this gallery and with Azu and us talking about the narrative of the show at large, because what that was a portrait essentially was about self-loathing and emotional disconnection. And so to try to answer your question is growing from that place where I've tried to engage in a more healthy relationship to myself and getting it out of my head, then as soon as you do that, you start to engage with the rest of the world, which in this case extended to being invited to Africa and our conversations and a friendship that has evolved from that, really. And I suppose, then it's funny because as I feel like I'm veering towards that and opening up and being able to enjoy and actually feel life, rather than having that metaphorical pigskin over me, and so I can engage with other people. It's like the world is coming back into that and encouraged into that through the addiction of social media and smartphones and sort of more an isolation, which is perpetuated ultimately just to make money for the people who own those things. And what I've kind of, just to finish it off, and then hopefully someone will ask a question to Azu perhaps, is that from that point I've forgotten exactly what I was going to say because I'd rather listen to Azu. So you wanted to ask Azu a question. It doesn't have to be profound. It could be like, where did you buy your jacket today? I know you lost your suitcase when you flew over, for example.
What's your favourite work in the show?
Oh, I love the sculptures. I think the sculptures are amazing. I love everything, but the sculptures are particularly striking. And I think also it comes back to what we had discussed earlier on about pressure, working under pressure. The idea was not to have the sculptures in the gallery in the first instance, but James ridiculously worked so hard over a very short period, and I think they're remarkable.
Thanks. Actually, they were as a byproduct of us trying to ship something back from Lagos, which we were unable to get here on time, and it was like a blessing in disguise, actually. But I guess, what was I going to say? Nothing.
Yeah, the vendors.
Yeah, I didn't want to give away the idea. We're going to do another show. Cut that off.
James,
Yeah.
you've got many facets within the show. Reference to a mattress. Reference to many areas. What can you pinpoint them all briefly? Like what metaphor are they?
there's a lot to answer in that question, and I'm sort of, yeah, in a nutshell, the mattresses featured beginning and end through my work. My earliest works had mattresses in them, and it's just, as someone who, I suppose, as someone who's come from a platform in the past of like a stronger relationship to depression and anxiety that I do have now, like my drug of choice was to stay in bed and not get out. So, it's sort of that, the mattress really is the platform of life and death, love and sex to me as much as anything. So it's emblematic, like this piece here is sort of the chieftain, the white male, but I deliberately, these are hand-selected mattresses from California, from a derelict town that I'm a part of a larger project called Bombay Beach Biennale. And this one I specifically chose because of its floral patternings, because actually, like ultimately, in my mind I was thinking about the spectrum of feminine to masculine, and whether the issues within the negative issues of greed and domination were more within the realm and the spectrum of the masculine rather than the feminine, in terms of community, love, sharing, caring, family dynamic. And actually, as all I purport to try to do in my work is learn, and so when you start having conversations like that and throwing that kind of construct of dialogue around with friends of yours who are feminists or extreme feminists, or people who are extreme misogynists, or whatever it is, it's like what I learned was kind of interesting, and it's just new to me, was talking about it from a hormonal perspective, which is like a rebranding of looking at that, but it's too much to go into now.
Now, I have a question actually. So what do you consider to be the counterpoint for the mattress? If you had to make work like maybe an intellectual space or a space for dialogue, sort of the opposite counterpoint?
Well, my therapist, who I used to see 14 years ago, was like, why can't you make a happy piece of art? And I think like if she was here tonight, I'm not, I wouldn't say specifically an individual piece in this show was one of those things. What I would say to her, hello Victoria, is that actually the overall show is a happy piece of work for me, because what it's done is broken through a cultural taboo, like an inbred, you could go as far as saying racism, in terms of like my fear of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and also that having like an engagement where I arrive somewhere in fear, as we discussed earlier in terms of my experience at the airport, and then being welcomed by Azu and the team of the photo festival, and I was surrounded in a bunch of people who I really looked up to, people, world famous war photographers and for newspapers, all these, and I make this stuff basically in my studio protected. And these guys are the people who shoot down the lens of a rifle in a war zone. And they were like, yeah, come and hang out. And it was just such a different perspective, fear-based perspective, but one with them, like, not in terms of fear of difference. And it was just, this is where they worked, and these were their friends. And it was like, God, I've lost track of what I was saying, actually. What was the beginning of this?
The counterpoint. Well, where would you find maybe an intellectual space to make work of an opposite but similar space? Because I was thinking the dining table would be like an interesting, I think human beings were civilized on the dining table.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like the counterpoint for the mattress, in an intellectual way for you, in terms of another space where you can think about work in a similar but opposite fashion.
Yeah. I suppose I can only really talk about it in terms of where I feel like I'm going next, and the sculptures are the most recent work. And something I like about that is, with the stuff I'm more well known for now, is these sort of semi-permanent sculptures on people, and there's a limitation to how long someone can stay under all of that, or what I'm enjoying about making the sculptures is there's a bit more planning, but there's still the freedom of happy accidents. So just from a you know, from a medium basis, that's where I can see myself heading more and enjoying that. And actually, because, you know, it's quite painful to when these things go, you know, like I really get the absolute beauty of these works because they're in front of me, they're moving and they're breathing, you know.
And the flip-flops, the sort of the global journey, the migratory journey they've had leading up to today, for example.
Yeah.
Lagos, originally in China.
Yeah. Yeah, well that, I mean, we've talked about this a lot. You know, it's like, I've been collecting flip-flops in Lagos for 4 years now, and when Ai Weiwei brought all his stuff out in the immigration, I was like, oh, my ego was like, oh my God, he's done the multiple thing, this is destroyed and ruined. And then it's like, I held on to them, and I have my own relationship with them, and I was like, and I had a compulsion to keep collecting them. It was like a commodity almost that I'd become addicted to. And that I has journeyed, you know, to California, to the desert, to a derelict town where it's wallpapered in the same way like this. Me and a patron, I suppose you'd call him, of me, bought a house in a derelict town for $7,000. And, you know, I did it in the similar vein to this, and that house is instantaneous, after 2 years, worth 4 times the value. So it's like, strangely, it's had, you know, amongst with other amazing artists who I've worked with there, where my friend Greg Habernet, all the way over from New York, he's one of the other artists there. And this town has, you know, it's gentrification. So there's like a problematic relationship between art and money. There always has been. And then the fallout of that. So somehow I'm going to turn this into a question back to you, which is like, how this is a question I'd like to know for myself, is like, how, when you're talking about political art, or people who try to make political art, within the context of the art world, there is, you know, a relationship between having to sell it. And as you mentioned with Mila and her, you know, in the way she supports artists, she takes huge risks, you know, and thank God that she's able to do that, to put on such an incredible show where she's like, yeah, James, I'm willing to hang a piss and shit stained mattress on a prime location in Mayfair without any knowledge of whether that's going to sell or not, you know. But how ultimately, what I want to ask you is how, when you obviously, like everyone else does, needs funding, how can you invariably that money can come from, you know, oil companies that might be, you know, having some negative effect environmentally, and then you've got a bunch of artists who want to make work about those companies. So how do you deal with that balance?
It's a really good question. Personally, I feel like you should always take the money, as long as you do not make work for, you know, that is directed or dictated by, you know, institutions that you feel uncomfortable with. So it's if it's, I don't know, Shell, they've tried to support a show, an exhibition, why not? But if Shell is asking you to make propaganda for them, then it's a totally different discussion. I always feel like they owe you, take the money. The conundrum is not a conundrum in my mind. It's only a problem if you're worried about making work for that you do not believe in, for people that you do not respect. I've been invited to curate a show for the president, or someone related to a president or a leader, and there was no work. And so of course I didn't curate the show, but you know, that's an engagement that is based on a professional decision. So if it's about sponsoring a project or funding a project, the patrons do not matter. The Medicis were not the most friendly people, and we all, you know, respect and value the collection that they funded and they facilitated all of those years ago. So it's I understand, of course, that it's you have to wrangle with your conscience, but do not make work for people you do not respect, but make work for yourself as an artist. And I think also there's a conflation between the art world and the art market sometimes, and people get them twisted. It's the art world exists and the art market exists, and sometimes they mix and sometimes they don't. And so if you find yourself making work outside of the market, that's a wonderful thing, and that's a really positive thing. And then there's the occasion where they can, connect and they separate again. So it's really, they feed each other, the art world and the art market, but they do not have to, we can exist separately.
I'm glad I asked that. I know I hope people in the room start to understand why I love him so much. Has anyone got inspired to ask a question? Oh, you can't give him a second question. Oh, God.
Okay, so I'm just really interested in the medium of you doing sculpture and photography, because when you do photography, it's like a really big setup, and you have real people underneath these beings, these characters. It takes a long time to set up. And how do you feel about then making a sculpture? Is it a relief that someone's not under there, or do you have more time? Do you feel better, or because it's quite hard work, I would assume, being one of these models. So yes, it is. Yeah. So how does that form? How does that feel? Because the sculpture, you can definitely see the lineage from your photographs, but it's very different. So, but how did you talked about it a bit earlier about the sculpture? But do you enjoy the non-human aspect of that?
Yeah, I think I'll answer that while the mic's being passed to someone else for another question. Invariably, it's strange. It might sound strange, but the personality of the people under the works does come through in some way or another. It's the process of me making the works will always involve me going to the butcher at 3 in the morning, and then Billingsgate Market Fishery at 5. Then I'll get back to the studio. I'll start working with the meat, which is laboursome. It's really heavy, and anyone who sat for me will say that it is like having a small child strapped to their head and various other parts of their bodies in terms of weight. And I don't feel like there's a different sense in terms of the sculpture, because this is more of like a performance and an evolution where bits fall, and then almost you don't have the choice. Some of the choices you don't have that then come back with sculpture, because you can replay or reset something, in a slightly more detailed way. But how about someone who's got that lady there with the glasses?
Well, I wanted to ask you, how would you think this show would be accepted in Lagos?
I'm going to get, is that directed to Azu?
Both, I don't know.
I wouldn't have a clue, so I'm going to pass that to Azu.
I don't know. I really don't worry too much about, when I think of work or when I curate shows, I don't worry too much about the audience. I don't make work or curate shows for the audience. I think in the past, I learned very early not to condescend to, the audience, because people are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. I think people get this work. It's also very intuitive, it's visceral, but also very, very clever, I think. So I think people get it, and people, will pay attention, will get it.
I have got some degree of an answer to that question, actually. I know that people in Lagos think I'm completely insane for collecting flip-flops, and when I go to the port, and I'm the only white guy who's at the port and generally goes to the port, I know they think I'm completely nuts, especially when you know how much I spend to ship this stuff back. And then I know that when you show it in California, people start crying and looking at the flip-flops and just feeling kind of emotive about human loss and sort of immigration and death. And I know that in Lagos, when they look at these flip-flops, you'll notice so much of the rubber is not in the thong of the flip-flops, and they just see it as like recycled rubber that they can generate in something way more interesting and they're much actually having a far greater relationship to looking after the planet than most of us are with our plastic bags from Tesco's. So it's kind of funny because it's ultimately about perception, isn't it? So that, I'm really glad you asked that question.
In terms of affecting change, what would be the most ideal outcome for you, for your work? What would you love to see?
James.
Okay, so going back to what I said earlier, like the outcome has been that it's helped me become happier and have a greater relationship to life. So on a personal level, that's great. And as I've expanded out into sort of more of a sort of like political narrative and developing relationships with, different people showing art around the world, I'm meeting different people and expanding as a human to see, the world from a perspective other than my own, at least a little bit more than I did, trying to break out of my bubble. And then, I've had people who write to me and talk to me about an eating disorder they've never mentioned to anyone in their life. They have 30 employees, they have a business, and they pretend that they're in meetings, but actually, they said to me they were in their dressing gown all day, stuffing themselves full of food, throwing up all day until the point at 5 o'clock they get dressed up in their $3,000 suit for their partner to arrive home as if they've had a fully functioning day. So to have those kind of human discussions and essentially removing a level of shame, so there's a conversation that I'm able to have with someone, that's in that case, but then in the context of how this show's evolved and my relationship with Azu, it's like, and if ultimately when you're looking at the word shame and you look at what's happened with Trump in America and politics there, it's like the working class white male in America is why Trump's in power. Essentially, he has the strength in terms of the vote. Now, generationally, there's those people who, they haven't had a job at all and their father lost their job. Their town is completely fucked and no one's caring about them either. And if you're shaming them into saying, look, it's the white male that's the problem with the entire planet and the world at large and why we're all completely fucked, then he will come in for a second term, right? So in some ways, what I'm hoping is, to like say, look, I understand that I am within the bracket almost of like, the tribal elite. I have the privilege of making art, being in a gallery in Mayfair, traveling to different parts of the world with my job and doing something that I love and enjoy. And so what I hope is that essentially, actually, I can remove the shame of being a white male in America by going, actually, we all have the same worries, fears, and we're all being fucked, actually, right at the top. And that's the only way those people are going to care about anyone else. And yes, it's a difficult subject and not one academically, like I'm in a position to, you could give me 10 questions from anyone vaguely sensible, they'd probably just destroy what I've just said. But it's like, because they are way more advantageous than people of colour in America and women and everyone else. But they hold the power of who's making the decisions and the choices. So they almost have to be included in how we get and work into a narrative for change. Does that make sense? Someone asked Azu a question. Go on, I dare you.
Well, I wanted to ask you the question, is there anything, because a lot of this, your work is about realizing and actualizing something, a conflict within yourself, or resolving some kind of conflict with yourself. And I just keep going with that story. Is there anything you've lost by creating this work? Is there anything that you feel you've lost in this process?
That's
For better or worse?
Being vulnerable. Being vulnerable, I suppose.
Azu, if you didn't hear that, just said being vulnerable. And that, yeah, I mean, I honestly feel like I've gained everything from this experience, and it's profound. Like it's deeply moving. Just the experience of having a wider perception, a wider like emotional concern for outside of yourself, you know, makes you able to be more empathetic, and then that will grow into caring, and then that will grow into community, and then that will grow into you know, hopefully change. So yeah, what I've lost is selfishness and self-centeredness, as much as an artist who's sitting in front of a camera with a mic on.
Do what's necessary. I've got a question. So as you've just had a really exciting new appointment, the museum, which is like the equivalent of the Tate Modern.
Oh, it's not at all. It's not at all.
So.
And I was friends with him before he was even that big.
Congratulations.
Thank you, thank you.
How are you going to get that message out to the wider world? What you're doing, what your manifesto is, how are you going to convey that? Because it's important to get that out, that message.
It's a really good question. I suppose the first thing I need to do with the museum, it's nearly a year old now, so it's what I call to decolonize the cultural aesthetic around Africa. And you know, the mission of the museum, I probably need to sort of address that very quickly, is sort of to collect and do research around 21st century art in relation to Africa and diaspora. But we plan to expand that to, we are not trying to niche ourselves at all. So it's not a museum for Africa, it's a museum for the world, hosted in Africa, by Africa. And to decolonize is, by that I mean, is to engage and to begin to tell the stories from a unique perspective that is centrally African. And if that sounds a bit strange, it's just basically to say that this isn't about, you know, for us, by us, or anything like that. It's really a home. We want to make the museum a home for the world. It's going to be a place that tells stories, a place that researches and houses work from artists from every corner of the globe. So it's right from the entrance all the way up to the top floor where we have a restaurant, it's going to have an African feel. We want to be welcoming, we want to be warm, we want to have food that sort of represents the entire range of the continent. Right now at the museum we've got foie gras and a lot of French food on the menu, and it's a fantastic chef as well. But we want it to be an African museum. We want to have a multiplicity, again, as I say, of stories. And we don't want people to feel like if you think about a global museum today, the Tate or MoMA or any of the museums that we respect and we value and we love, they are struggling and they are trying to represent a global view of the world. So it's not about the Museum for Modern Art is constantly trying to show work from other parts of the world. And we are not trying to chase that narrative. We want to be part of it. So it's not about showing, oh, we're going to be exclusive about what we show. No, we want to be inclusive. And that's really where Africa has always been. In the past, that inclusivity made Africa vulnerable, and maybe that created a lot of problems for us. But now we think we have the power, we have the agency, we can own the narrative. We want to shape the future of contemporary Africa that way.
Can I ask, that inclusivity creating problems, can you expand on that point?
As you know, James, here, with Lagos Photo Festival, for example, a lot of local criticism that I've received is about why do we have so many international artists on view? And my answer has always been the same. It's a global international platform. You know, we do not expand knowledge by being anti-intellectual, and by that I mean being exclusive as a sort of revenge, or you shoot yourself in the foot by not including people, including the global voices and sharing. That's just not the way to gain knowledge. And if you think that knowledge is power, then how do you now shut out other voices? And so it's really about inclusivity and being in charge and driving that narrative from that inclusive viewpoint, if you like.
Wow.
Hi.
Wait for the mic. Wait for the
I
mic.
don't need the mic.
Yeah, you do.
I got a deep voice.
We're recording this.
Yeah. I just want to say congratulations to both you guys. I kind of had an inside glance at this from really the beginning stages. I'm from New York. And that's where I live, and it's a real hotbed in the States, and everything's a nightmare right now. Not very proud to admit, that I'm an American right now in this world, but anyways, it is what it is. But one of the things that I find really ironic and absolutely amazing about this, and there's so many different turns that you can go about in this, like when you view the works, when you view the metaphors and the subliminal messages and the things that they mean. But there's something that James said about the elitism of the white male and things like that. And as Azu said, kind of to paraphrase, about opening up the doors and certain things. And what I see is, like, as artists in general, there's always a struggle and a plight, but one of the most amazing things about progress in the world is that you have a brilliant African-American curator that gave you the opportunity. That's, to me, is fantastic, because we know how we struggle in the art world of just getting any form of recognition on anything. And I just think that's kind of watching you go through what you've had to go through, James, and like really struggle and kind of fight with things. And it's like, we often talk about like the differences amongst people and things like that, but it's like, it shows like in that way, like a really, in a small way, whatever way you want to call it, but just like an amazing form of progress that, you know what I mean? You're trying to put a voice about something, and then you have someone, with a culturally different background than yours, giving you an opportunity, and that's pretty amazing when you think about it. And I'm not trying to say I came up with an epiphany of thought, but that's what all this is about. It's open dialogue. It's about being able to look at these, like, I even look at the images myself as like the distortion of like who I am on the inside, as you and I have discussed many times, and mentally deranged and nuts and crazy, or somebody can look at this in different variations, and it really is society, but I think it's just absolutely beautiful that the dialogue amongst the two of you is a dialogue that may be interpreted as, oh, we can't have this, when in actuality, the progress is we're having it.
Yeah.
So it is successful. And
Yeah.
I congratulate the two of you, man. I've watched you bust your ass for a couple of years, man. And it's really amazing, man, just to be
I'm
here
not
and
paying
see
him,
this.
by the way.
Yeah.
And I didn't offer to.
No, but congratulations
Thanks.
to both
Yeah.
of you, honestly.
That was pretty good going. That's like 3 minutes to go.
What was the plan?
And just to stand you corrected on one point, Azu's an African, so even more of a gift than an African American.
We're all these people. That's it, man.
Sorry.
Okay. Hi, I'm from Africa. I'm an anthropologist. I spent most of my life in the bush with tribes. And this is very definitely an African exhibition, from my perspective. I have a couple of questions. One is the theme of addiction that runs through your conversation and your interview. Were you an addict?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone is in some degree or another on the spectrum.
Yes, but not everyone uses the rehab terminology. So has that affected your work and your perception of reality by having had those experiences?
Yeah, I think, like I was saying earlier, I think, going into a place of isolation, I mean, it's so debatable, addiction. What makes one person an addict? What makes another person an addict? There's people who go to Alcoholics Anonymous who've only had one glass of wine a week. There's people who drink half a bottle of whiskey a night and feel completely okay about how they live. So,
So you're not an addict then, yeah. Okay, just moving on there. This issue, this issue here of the colonialist, tribalist chieftain What exactly are you saying there? That you felt that you were that when you were in Africa, or that is how white men are perceived, or that's how you felt people treated you, or what?
I'm so loving this question. Sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted. Were you finished on your question?
Yeah, just how that fits into your, where that feeling came through your African experience. Is it you, or is it another white man, or is it the way the black man saw you and that's how you felt? That, you know, you talk about submission and colonialism, and it's called colonial tribal chieftain.
Mm-hmm.
So what exactly does it represent? Me, or you, or him, or just a feeling?
That is a great question. I can answer it from a couple of different ways. So the reason that's a self-portrait is, so far all that I've mentioned in terms of the journey of Azu inviting me to Lagos was when I actually arrived, I was freaked out, and then within 3 or 4 days I found myself, you know, going off with a couple of friends, like I mentioned, sort of war photographer mentality, certainly braver than a neurotic West Londoner who never left his studio really. And I found a Prada flip-flop on the beach, a child's Prada flip-flop, and that like emoted, this is in 2015/16, so obviously our entire media outlets were, you know, showing, you know, rubber dinghies coming over from Africa loaded up with people floating up on the beaches of the Mediterranean. So I went straight to that, as you would even before any of that, when you see a child's glove in the street or a sock. However much you know that probably just fell out the cart because there was a tired mother pushing it, you still are like, oh, I hope it's okay. And so I saw this Prada flip-flop, and then I saw another flip-flop, and it was like, I was like, wow. And these two guys had followed me for an hour because where I landed on this beach, they wanted me to come back, buy some fish, have a Coke from their shack rather than the competition. And I was like, guys, come over. Would could I employ you $10 an hour to help me collect flip-flops for 2 hours? Now that's more than the minimum wage in London and New York. So they were thrilled, I was thrilled. We did this thing like a fair trade organisation in my head. And then one of them had a mobile phone, spoke slightly better English. And I was like, I'm gonna come back tomorrow and I want 10 guys, is what I said, thinking about it. And was going to be $200, and I want 10 times what we had. I arrived the next day, came to the beach, he veered me off to where he lived, we were drinking tea, he was showing me family pictures. It suddenly got into this sort of management level where I was like the CEO of a company in Switzerland without knowing what was going on over there. And it kind of, within 24 hours, escalated into that detachment. And then when I got to the beach, you know, there was a pregnant lady, very heavily pregnant lady, collecting with her small child, a really old guy, and I was like, this wasn't the standard I'd set. Like, I've dropped my standards because I already see this in a museum, and I'm just gonna carry on, because this is what I want. I see it already. And so it's like, I don't know if that's answering your question in any way whatsoever, but it was like, for me, like...
Did you feel like a colonialist when you were in Africa? Did you meet people who gave you the idea of this tribal chief under an archway?
Well, I made myself a tribal chief of my own little scenario, and I felt bad about. I recognised that my moral barometer had shifted on the basis of a commodity that I wanted, and that actually had no value to anyone else before I got there, and then I created a value to it that then disrupted that little micro area, because by the end of this 2-day scenario, I was throwing bribes around, I was being attacked with sticks by people who didn't want me to take what was rubbish 2 days ago off their island. And so it escalated into a social disruption based on my intervention. And I guess that would that fall into the remit of colonialism?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. No. Nope. Not at all.
Sorry, the last question is for Azu. Is I do a lot of, such as there is, art exhibitions in Africa, and I feel that it's one of the things that people in Africa do connect viscerally to. It's not about purple prose. It's not about developed concepts. It's just a sort of gut reaction, which is, in a sense, very much what art is about. And I know nothing about art. But one of my concerns is the 180 Rand entrance fee into the Zeitz Museum, because it's a very high amount for your average Joe in South Africa. The middle classes who are wearing the Pradas, whatever color they are not worried, but I think they're focused on different things, the creation of wealth and business, climbing the ladder. I think this appeals to a much bigger range, but they would be precluded by the entry price. And then I looked at the times that you do have openings, but they're during the working week. And with transport and things like that, people can't go during the week. There's no point in having weekly. We don't have people who've got the money to go and do it in the week. But if you did it free on a Saturday or a Sunday, then I feel that you would create a whole new, if not art market, because we're not in the money side there, but a whole new level of appreciation and education for people who can't afford the entrance. Thank you.
I didn't understand.
And I do understand.
Yeah.
Really good question. It's maybe it's unfair to James to begin to respond to the museum's.
No, please do. Absolutely.
Sorry, I thought he asked us to ask you questions.
Well, it's fine, but
I was obliging.
to be fair, it's a really good point, and it's a criticism that I've heard a few times, and it's just been a week, 2 weeks since I've been there, so give me time. We will. I promise though to really look at all of that. The museum is not a year old yet, so it's. We need time we're building an institution. An institution means that it's a legacy project. It will be there after we're all gone. And that's the hope, and that's the mission, and that's the vision. So we will look at that. I care about that very much. I care about the demographics that are able to see shows in the museum. I do care.
And this wouldn't apply to the question you've just asked, because I didn't really understand what was built around it at all. And I appreciate you answering it in this context. Obviously, I want that freedom completely. But, what I realized and have seen over the number of years, like I said, where I'm having the fortunate growth of starting to be around people like Azu and other people who are in some way trying to affect change, which I don't include myself in that at all, but very serious activists and people, global players in that area, often, and I don't relate this to you at all in that question, but often people who are trying to affect change are often vilified for the 10% of what they can or can't do or are trying to do, which is often taken on by the press as finding the chinks in the armor of those people who are trying to affect change, rather than actually welcoming and promoting a dialogue around what they are achieving. And that is a very interesting human negativity that I think holds back a lot of change, personally. Should we finish, or has anyone got yeah? Do you want the microphone? Yeah. How is everyone? Are you knackered? Are you bored? Can you do another 5 minutes? I mean, I'll be talking to Azu all night, so I'm just going to carry on, but you might want to go somewhere for food, I don't know.
Yeah, question to both of you. How did you arrive at the title for the show, and who is Johnny?
Do you want to answer that?
I think it's a great question, actually, because it sort of ties in everything. So it's a journey.
Just to interrupt, if he says that it wasn't his idea and it was my idea, he's lying and just being like, oh, he's the artist. It was his idea.
Journey just came as a term that we use in Lagos to refer to a novice, someone who's like naive. So James is just Johnny just come, that's the term. So it means like a newbie, if you like. And so it's really an honest title, because it really means that everything that we're doing, we're just really seeking for knowledge, where we don't pretend to have all the answers. It's all about the engagement that creates the journey, that creates that facilitates knowledge and progress. So this exhibition really is not the solution we don't feel like we have answers. We are not anthropologists. We are not cultural theorists. We're just basically presenting work to create the space for cultural dialogue and interaction. So that's really Journey Just Came is about. Journey Just Came is a statement that refers to that lack of expertise.
Okay, I'm really glad I asked the question because I had some other.
So James is Johnny in this context.
Thanks for asking it. I can't feel the energy in the room at all. I'm so excited. I'm just in this warm, loving space. So if anyone wants to ask a question before we end, just put your hand up. If there's like 2 or 3 people, or just one, we can finish on that, and that's cool.
Sorry if you've already told us, maybe I didn't hear, but I noticed you have a lot of fish in your art, and if there's not fish, there's marine-related, items like lobster. Yeah, that's a lobster. Fish nets, cables for what look like they use for sails or tying the boat to, the dock. So I'm just curious, why is there so much of a theme of marine-based theme? And
another great question, thank you. Well, there's a whole other world of that we're not, I mean, I don't know the statistics in terms of the water in relation to land, but it's that overall concern for the planet at large, really coming from an environmental perspective. The first pieces I made out of fish were actually for a charity auction, which I've now forgotten what it was called, but the pieces were called High Grade 1 and High Grade 2. And at that point I learned, in terms of fishery, high grade fish is like your Dover sole that you would order in any restaurant around here. Now that is high grade fish because that's what will give the fisherman a greater amount of wealth in terms of transacting it into the market of fish. And then anything else that the restaurants aren't serving, or they consistently want to serve the same product, they just throw the low grade fish back into the sea, and often it is dead and disturbed, and environmentally it's a catastrophe. And the dredging of the water. So it's just like, I guess, what was the question? Why so much fish? I suppose it's just like an expression of the ecosystem. And the reason I use animal parts is probably an easier answer. So I use animal parts from the food chain, and as you might notice in a lot of the pieces, I brought the eyes actually forward on the works. And so there's an unavoidable engagement with the animal kingdom in the works. That, to my mind, is as far away as I can take it from you just inanimately taking a steak out of a packet. And to refer back to what you were saying about the sea, it's like, this world is under the water, so, we can be almost in more denial about it, but we're fucked. I'd like to finish on the fact that we're not fucked. And thank you for coming, and thanks to Azu, and thanks to Mila and the gallery, and you all for coming. So.